Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 613 through 615, which will cover manga chapters 687 through 689. And saving the kids is proving to be difficult with keeping Monet at bay while Caesar continues his cruel ways towards Brownbeard and the kids. Alright, so short synopsis. Zoro and Tashigi must take down the snow-powered harpy Monet to keep her from pursuing the other Straw Hats and the kids while they work to restrain the children, as Mocha has to make a terrible sacrifice to protect her friends from the harm of the candies. Alright, so differences. For the most part, these episodes are actually pretty well accurate to what they are in the manga, with some slight additions and sort of extensions of scenes, but most of them aren't really anything too big. Like, for example, you have a couple more scenes of people running down halls, like with Usopp and Brownbeard, as they're looking for their separate things with Brownbeard and his crew, and Usopp and the Sea Stone handcuffs, as well as things like Tashigi waking up and noticing that she's being carried by Zoro. Those are all really minor things that just kind of add flavor. They don't really add all that much to the story, nor take away anything, so they're really just meant to make the episodes fall in line with where they want the cliffhangers to be at the end of the episode, or to line up with like the commercial breaks and stuff like that. Is my thinking behind all these little changes. There are two somewhat medium-sized changes that are a little bit more noticeable, I guess. So the anime cuts up the Tashigi versus Monet fight in the middle, with a filler scene of Usopp running from the poison gas looking for the Sea Stone handcuffs, which is annoying, but I feel like there's a funny little reference in this scene. So Usopp can be heard saying handcuffs, handcuffs, where could they be? But the way he says handcuffs in Japanese is the part to pay attention to here. So in Japanese, handcuffs is tejo, or sometimes just jo, as te is just Japanese for hand, and jo is handcuffs or restraints. So Usopp in this scene just says Jo, like Jo, which I feel like he's imitating the South Bird from Jaya, which is also something that they use to find something, and in that case it was the knock upstream. Now I could be completely wrong here, but I feel like this sounds way too similar to the South Bird cry, that this is a actual legitimate sort of callback joke to the South Bird's unusual call. Now, this next one is a really minor difference that isn't a big deal at all, but one that just affects the overall composition and kind of the coolness of one particular shot, and not anything related to anything else. And that's the final shot of Zoro slicing through Monet. So when he does the Daishinkan in the anime, they cut the two moments into two parts, where they have the money shot of Zoro standing there with his sword drawn, posing after he lands the finishing blow, but his back is to this like foggy, empty background, and he's now standing in front of Monet. However, in the manga, he ends the Daishinkan behind her, almost as if he sliced through her, with not only the same pose, with the money shot, but in the manga you can actually see Monet being sliced up behind him, which makes for a much cooler image. And I think I know why they changed this, and it's probably because they wanted to storyboard this sequence to create sort of dramatic tension to be drawn out, and to be able to show the attack, but then leave the suspense of wondering what effect it had on Monet. But I feel like this could have still been accomplished with the way the original panel in the manga was intended, with, showing the snow and fog kind of obscuring what's behind him, and then having all those secondary shots of all the reaction shots of the different faces between Tashigi and Monet and Zoro, and then have them go back to that same shot while slowly dissipating the snow and fog to reveal that shot that was in the manga where Zoro is still in his pose, but now you can see Monet being split in half behind him. And I feel like that could have worked, because as soon as, that she gets split up, then her snow and blizzard powers basically just disappear, and it makes sense that now you can see what's behind him. And so from like, not only from like a dramatic tension standpoint, but also from like a in-world explanation, it makes perfect sense. Now, this isn't a big deal and is incredibly such a small nitpick on my part, but it's one that I feel like I wanted to point out just cause I think that the shot is so cool in the manga, and this moment is so cool in the manga. And while it is still really cool in the anime, I do feel like having that shot of him standing behind her and her splitting in half over his shoulder, I think is such a cool shot that's kind of lost in the anime. And it didn't get made up with the way that they could have done it in the anime. I mean, they could have completely changed this, but if it made it better, I wouldn't have missed it so much. But they basically did the same thing but made it slightly worse. Is my biggest issue with it. All right, so now with the differences out of the way, let's get into the episodes themselves. So this set of episodes begins picking up that thread about whether Zoro would or wouldn't cut a woman with the conversation between Sanji and the G5 Marines. And I love this conversation. One, I just love seeing people outside of the Straw Hats begin to really learn about who they are in a more nuanced way, seeing that they're not just these ruthless pirates like everyone else, and simple-minded, and violent people that most people imagine when they imagine pirates. And they learn that Sanji would rather die than hurt a woman, and they're all impressed by this, but also the shock of how different of a philosophy that the two people on the same crew can seemingly have. But Sanji then kind of smirks and says that Zoro also has a soft spot too, kind of leading us to believe that perhaps Zoro won't in fact cut women, which again kind of surprised me. I've mentioned this back when, but it's always been a little unclear to me because Zoro's whole character is a little hypocritical on the surface at this point in the story. During his flashback, he lectures Kuina about how he'd look stupid if he ever beat her, and she just falls back on the excuse that she's a woman. From there, they make the fateful promise to each other that one of them would become the greatest swordsman or swordswoman in the world as equals, regardless of their sex. And now, the first time this is ever tested is when he runs into Tashigi at Logtown. Now, you could chalk that moment up to him not wanting to cut down Tashigi, not so much of the fact that she's a woman, but rather she was the spitting image of a grown-up version of Kuina, his late childhood best friend. And since then, outside of the Miss Monday moment, which he only made her pass out, he's never been put in a position to really have to cut a woman down until now, basically. So at this point, I was wondering, which is he more like? Is he more like Sanji, or would Zoro actually cut down a woman if it's necessary, unlike Sanji, who would in fact let himself get killed if he had to choose between harming a woman and his own life? Based on the evidence we've seen so far throughout the series, I think this is much more of a nuanced situation. I think if Zoro could choose, cutting down a woman isn't something he wants to do, but unlike Sanji, if it actually did come down to it and he had to, he actually would. He does seem to have a soft spot for women, just as Sanji has said, and there have been plenty of moments where he's favored women. The most famous example of that comes to mind is during Skypiea in the ruins, during the tail end of NL's survival game, when NL shocks Robin and Zoro gingerly catches her and saying, she's just a woman, implying that this isn't how you treat a woman even on the battlefield. But to me, this moment always felt a little out of character, as this sort of gender difference shouldn't matter given his stance on it towards Kuina when they were little kids. And that's the point where I started to think maybe one of Zoro's character traits or sort of character flaws is that he's a little sexist. So this whole subsection of this arc was very interesting to see if we will get a definitive answer to this question. But honestly, as we see, the result is still left just as ambiguous as we came in, but leads to another one of Zoro's more badass quotes and scenes. And this is also a fun moment to see Tashigi in action for once, and see her now that she has some more strength since the time skip. And as you all know, Tashigi is one of my favorite side characters, so it's great to see her get to have somewhat of a real fight. And this fight is pretty brutal for Tashigi though, as she nearly gets her shoulder and arm bitten right off, but Zoro comes in to save her at the last minute. And this is where we see Zoro actually give Monet a slight cut on her face. One thing that's pretty obvious to everyone, but I still want to point out, is that Zoro comes in to save Tashigi as if he's now impatient and is tired of watching. But he chose this moment because he doesn't want to see Tashigi get wounded too badly, which is what basically Sanji was referring to, was that he was essentially reassuring the other G5 soldiers that Tashigi is in good hands, because despite the fact that they are both kind of unwilling to harm women, that when it came down to it, Zoro would protect Tashigi because he has a soft spot for certain women. even though he'll never admit it. But then we get one of the most badass Zoro quotes of the entire series. In fact, this whole freaking scene is amazing. From him telling her that she's underestimated him and that the minute she determined that she couldn't beat him is when she should have just ran. And then we get the now iconic, there are things that I don't want to cut, but let me ask you, have you ever come across a fierce animal where you were sure would never bite you? Because I haven't. And then proceeds to beat Monet in probably the most humiliating yet terrifying way by slicing her in half with his sword with the one sword style Dai Shinkan or Great Dragon Shock move, but without using Haki, leaving Monet still alive but so traumatized and psychologically wounded that she can't even concentrate and put her body back together. And this doesn't completely knock out Monet as she does try to attack Zoro again, but is then finished by Tashigi, which just kind of further muddies the water in terms of whether Zoro will or won't cut a woman. And like I said, we never get a definitive answer to this question, but based on this fight, there is still a lot we can glean. And while you can't get a definitive answer, I think for me, I've come up with my own personal answer that I think most of the community has kind of landed on. But this scene is so freaking cool, despite all of that. I think, yeah, the character stuff is a little annoying that it's still left ambiguous, but everything else around this scene is so good. Because I don't know how you make Zoro so cool without him actually really having done anything. Like this, when you look at this fight, especially reading it week to week or watching it week to week, it doesn't quite like dawn on you, but when you watch both chapter or read both chapters or watch both episodes together, it really does paint Zoro as just this one moment, but everything leading up to it, he's not really doing much. But this one moment saves the entire like fight. And it's also another clever way for Oda to give Zoro a cool moment, but not have to push him to any sort of limit yet. Because Oda is saving Zoro's power up and him getting pushed to the limit till a little bit further down in the sort of the time skip era, because he doesn't want to have basically like Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji be tested too much in terms of like, because if they were already tested to get to their max and their sort of breaking point, then what would that training have been all good for? Like by the time they start, facing up against stronger opponents, then it won't make sense if they just keep getting random power-ups. And this is actually what happened with Bleach, unfortunately, is that it was never considered like future down the line, like what the escalation for their enemies would be. So each time a new arc started with Bleach, people would just have to start pulling out random bankais and random power-ups later in the series that never really quite felt earned. And so, yeah, I think Oda somehow managed to sidestep this by still giving his heavy hitters some cool moments, but while also finding good, clever ways to keep them from pushing themselves too much. But also kind of circling back to whether Zoro wants to or would or wouldn't cut a woman. My feeling on this is that, like Zoro says, there are things that he prefers not to cut. I think women and people who are far below him in strength, for example, like the people at Whiskey Peak, the bounty hunters, he basically left most of those small fry bounty hunters alive, taking them out non-lethally, as well as innocent people who are attacking him due to a misunderstanding, like the shipwrights of the Galila Company when they were attacking the Straw Hats due to being suspected of attempted murder on Iceberg. Again, he didn't cut those people. Despite his desire not to cut certain people, if forced to, he will cut them, and even kill women if he needed to. Unlike Sanji, and I think this is when he realized that Tashigi was in real danger, he did step in and actually cut Monet on the face, but he will find every possible way to avoid it, even leaving the finishing blow to Tashigi, fully expecting that she would, and she does. So yeah, that's kind of my conclusion, is that Zoro does not want to cut women, and will go to great lengths to avoid it, but if he absolutely had to, he would actually cut and kill a woman if forced to, unlike Sanji, who would just basically let himself get killed. But the lengths that Zoro will go to avoid cutting women, I think is what Sanji still sees in him. That, yeah, he is still pretty soft in that regard, and that's what he's hinting at earlier. While I do think Zoro has some sexist bias towards women, I don't think it's quite as overblown as a small portion of the community has kind of deemed it, that Zoro is kind of a sexist. But well, Zoro does have a slight bias that women are weaker, but that's biologically true in most cases. However, that doesn't necessarily hold much weight in the world of One Piece, since it really doesn't matter your size or your body. You can just be just as strong due to many other factors, even if you're a man or a woman, like devil fruits, like haki, or even the type of species you are, like whether it be the giants or the long arms. They have genetic basically advantages regardless. Like a female giant is going to still kick your ass regardless. And so yeah, I just think Zoro prefers not to kill people he doesn't have to, regardless of sex. Zoro is not afraid to kill, but at the same time, he doesn't enjoy it, so he avoids it if at all possible. And hilariously, where the community may have a point is actually not his sexism, but the age-old debate that Zoro is actually kind of racist towards black people or dark-skinned people, because coincidentally, he seems to always be matched up against dark-skinned people and beats them. Just to be clear, that's more of a meme joke than anything real. It just happens to be a really interesting coincidence that Zoro is always matched up against someone who is dark-skinned. And he just like, yeah, I don't quite know how to explain that one, but it just seems to keep happening. And Oda keeps putting Zoro up against a dark-skinned character, like when you really think about it. But again, I think that's more of just a funny observation that's not really true. So one other thing I wanted to talk about is I will argue that although Zoro didn't use armament haki, I still think he inadvertently used haki here, just not in the way you're thinking. I'm referring to haki in its more pure definitional sense, not that he used an actual haki technique like armament or observation or conquerors, but in that he used his overwhelming willpower to basically overwhelm Monet. It's kind of closer to what conquerors haki actually does to people. And I personally don't know if this was meant to be taken like that, but just looking at how haki is normally talked about, not in the sense of like a technique in the One Piece anime and manga, but just in general outside of One Piece, like what haki really is as a concept. But, you know, who knows? This could be a potential early foreshadow for Zoro having Conqueror's haki potentially later on, since Zoro's personality does scream that he should have it eventually, if not already. But at the same time, it could just be a cool thing Oda wanted to do, and it has nothing to do with actual Conqueror's haki. It's just literally just Zoro's sort of will or haki, and it's just overwhelming Monet to the point where she can't move. She's so scared and so intimidated and overwhelmed by Zoro's willpower and presence that she just falls apart mentally. And that's kind of like a small extension of what Conqueror's haki does to someone too. On the flip side, even though Tashigi got the finishing blow, I hate that this fight didn't really allow her to shine, which yet again, only being there to essentially build up the Straw Hats, in this case Zoro specifically. Smoker and Tashigi are these like really cool characters, at least in my opinion, who often don't get anything to work with, which is so frustrating as a fan of both of these characters. With Tashigi passing out from her wound, Zoro's got to carry her out as the B tower is now also beginning to fill up with the poison gas. But somehow, in a small circular room where the only exit is the opposite end of the room where the poison isn't leaking out of, Zoro somehow still finds a way to get lost in this room. And I gotta admit, this one is one of the more unbelievable ones, since he was right there, just like a minute ago, leaning up against that door. And I also love that in the middle of arguing about getting carried, Tashigi, still being the sword nerd, is shocked at seeing the legendary Shusui in Zoro's possession, which is understandable considering this is one of the 21 grade legendary swords, or great grade legendary swords, that no one outside of people on Thriller Bark probably have seen in several centuries. So yeah, I'd be freaking out too if I was Tashigi and like a sword connoisseur, but still kind of out of place as they're running for their lives at the same time. So moving on from Zoro and Tashigi, we get to the kids and the other Straw Hats. So, remember the most disturbing and horrific thing that Caesar caused that I mentioned a couple podcasts ago that we haven't seen yet? Well, this next scene is that moment where Nami, Robin, and Chopper are doing their best to subdue the frenzied kids, while Mocha is desperately trying to keep all the candy away from her friends. But eventually they catch up to her, leaving her no other options but to do the unthinkable. She sacrifices herself and eats all the candy to prevent anyone else from eating it, which in a dose that large is pretty much lethal, I feel like. And this is disturbing, but also nothing short of one of the most heroic things anyone has done in the series. And the way Ikue Otani as Chopper, she gives an incredible performance here and gives one of the most blood-curdling screams in anguish at what he was unable to stop, having no choice but to watch Mocha just eat all these candies that would most likely kill someone. The only saving grace is maybe that her giant body may actually help in kind of staving off and giving her the toughness to kind of hold off the poison at least a little longer than if she was just a normal child, which ironically, may end up saving her life. This entire sequence is pretty tough and really sad, seeing the flashback of how much hope the kids had being juxtaposed with the frightening and sad reality that they were all lied to and that they're slowly being killed. Seeing and hearing the betrayal in Mocha of the terrifying reality set in that they may not even have a future is honestly heartbreaking. Especially when she says it never even crossed our minds that we would die, and for a 9-year-old kid, why would a thought like that ever cross their minds? It shouldn't. And they should still have their whole lives ahead of them. But amongst all of this, in order to reassure them that they will get Caesar and help them, Chopper finally gets his Luffy will become the Pirate King declaration moment. Now, compared to many of the other members, their moments, this one is definitely much more understated. However, I don't think it's any less impactful. And it's a very appropriate one for Chopper. And since he's a doctor and a healer, it makes perfect sense that Chopper would say this to reassure a help and sick child and inspire them with it. Sure, it's not that, high up on many people's list, nor on my list of like, if you ranked all the different members' moments of when they declared that Luffy will be a Pirate King. But this one fits Chopper so well. It perfectly encapsulates who Chopper is and what being a Straw Hat means to him. Then we get to probably one of the most disturbing things in One Piece, and that's saying a lot because seeing Mocha on the floor spewing up blood was a pretty shocking panel to read the first time. And it's still chilling to see this to this day. I'm not sure why, but the manga feels even more disturbing than the anime. And looking at them both, I think it's the details in the manga with the shading and how much more claustrophobic the panel feels with the kids surrounding her, as well as the speech bubbles also kind of surrounding her. And it's honestly just so heartbreaking and sad and chilling to see. I still tear up seeing Mocha's sacrifice and telling Chopper that she didn't give them the candy, and Chopper trying to very scaredly reassure her. And one thing that I have only briefly touched upon up till now is how the theme of inherited will gets passed on from the Straw Hats to the next generation. Of course, we've talked about how our main characters have inherited wills from other mentors and characters from the past to the present day. And throughout the series, we have seen just how much the Straw Hats have been influencing people around them and passing on their wills to future generations. They're not only changing the present for the better, but with their actions, they're also inspiring a new generation of kids today to build a better future for them as well. It's not in every arc, but a lot of them, there are usually some kids present in them that represents this theme as well, and we go on to see what positive effects the Straw Hats' actions have had on these kids through brief snippets in the cover stories or sometimes follow-ups in the series proper. Some examples are obviously Kobe and maybe even Helmeppo, if you can consider him a kid. I mean, Kobe for sure was only like 16 at the time. He's not like a little child, but he's definitely still kid. As well as the Usopp pirate crew in Syrup Village, Chabo from Kokoyashi Village, that little kid that Nami kind of beat up but also saved at the same time, Kappa from Arabasta, the little kid that was basically almost killed for discovering that Moncler was impersonating the King Cobra, as well, of course, Isa from Skypiea, Chimney from Water 7, all the kids who witnessed the events of Fishman Island, because those kids, while they were mostly never named, they did get a lot of screen time of the kids seeing what the Straw Hats are and what it means to be a hero. And then, you have these kids now, as well as Momonosuke on Punk Hazard. And if you also want to include the kids who appear in the One Piece fan letter special, whether that's actually canon, I'm not entirely sure, but I mean, you could easily slot that stuff into the story. And while these kids from the fan letter stories are not necessarily like big players in the world, but you can see how the Straw Hats have influenced them. Now, I know I have yet to talk about the One Piece fan letter special, and I will try and do a special podcast episode to give kind of my thoughts and review of that special. And honestly, just TLDR, it's amazing. Definitely go see it if you've seen at least to the Return to Sabaody arc, because it's beautifully animated and an incredibly well-written story. So yeah, I will definitely try and talk about it at some point. However, as you can see though, this idea of passing on the inherited will that the Straw Hats have received is an important element to Oda's story that I feel he's building towards something which will no doubt pay off near the end of the series, or maybe in the epilogue of the series, because Oda will continue to highlight this and include kids in future arcs, where not only is the past being influenced by our heroes in the present day, but our present day heroes are also now influencing the next generation of kids. And so it'll be interesting to see how Oda pays that sort of through line and thematic story off at the end. When we get to episode 615, we catch up with a separate character in Brownbeard, as he's the first one to make it to the R66 door, trying to save his old crew. Unfortunately, he's drugged and manipulated by Caesar, making him unable to explain what is actually happening to him and everyone else. And all the men just sit there laughing at him, while Brownbeard is told the truth that his crewmates are already dead, and they were the ones that were out there on the sled, unfortunately, when Smiley basically exploded. Continuing to gaslight the other soldiers and to think that Brownbeard has turned on them and has them shoot the one person trying to save them all. It's honestly maddening to see Caesar get away with stuff like this over and over. This is especially angering after seeing what he had just done to poor Mocha in the previous episode. And I will say though, by this point, I was so over Caesar. So when Luffy comes in to save Brownbeard, I wasn't as hyped as I think that moment was supposed to land. What I did love about this scene is Luffy's compassion. It's like how he understands just how much pain Brownbeard is in right now, and how he reassuringly puts his hand on Brownbeard. Also the signal that it's finally time for Caesar to get his comeuppance for all of the horrible acts he's committed. Like, he has done so many terrible things, and that's kind of the only reason why you're rooting really for Caesar to get beat up. Because he's not necessarily a compelling villain. You just want to see him just get his ass handed to him, though. But before that, we yet again get some really juicy new info and lore dropped on us. But it comes at the cost of the pacing and momentum again. Just when you think we're about to get into a smackdown of Caesar, we have to launch into another exposition dump about admittedly really interesting things, so it doesn't bother you quite as much, or at least it didn't for me personally. But it is undeniable that it is really clunky, and I can certainly understand why people hate this arc, due in large part to this clunky storytelling structure. Regardless of how this information is delivered to us, he drops a bomb on us that this entire arc and island's purpose was supposedly for the introduction and production of the artificial zone type devil fruits called smile fruits. Ironically or poetically, depending on how you look at it, the fruits are called smile fruits, but they're made through a process using something called SAD, or SAD, which to me is the perfect encapsulation of what a real devil fruit is. It brings happiness and joy, usually for the ability that it grants, to people these extraordinary powers, but it's also a curse that comes along with those powers. However, the meaning of the names of each of these things goes far deeper, as we will learn as the series progresses. But to avoid spoilers, I'm not really going to go into that right now. Smile fruits were a pretty big deal when they were first introduced because it meant that there were going to be entire pirate crews made up of zone type devil fruits, and not just entire pirate crews, but apparently an emperor's crew filled with an army of devil fruit users, which sounds insane when you think about it. And up till now, most of the crews the Straw Hats have been up against only have a handful of the most powerful members of that crew having devil fruits. But now imagine that, but their henchmen and underlings all have powers as well. And the prospect of that definitely excited you at what sort of conflict could be coming down the road. However, one thing that I have a hard time remembering was kind of my thought process behind the difference between Vegapunk's fruit and Caesar's fruit at the time when I first read all of this. Like, I do vaguely remember thinking that I knew there had to be some sort of catch with these fruits because even Vegapunk seemingly admitted to the fact that his fruit had some sort of a defect. And given all the evidence that we've seen of Caesar's sort of scientific prowess compared to Vegapunk's, it was always going to be a certainty that it was going to be inferior in some way. So there had to be some sort of a defect with these as well. But for some reason, I can't for the life of me remember what else had actually crossed my mind at the time. Yeah, so kind of to make sure that I don't start blending my current memories with my old memories, I'm just gonna avoid speaking about this just in case I don't want to leak a spoiler of some kind. So I'll just leave it at that. But I do remember freaking out at the time. Like, I was like, holy crap, they can make artificial devil fruits and give them to anyone. But I always knew that there had to be a catch of some sort. The last thing I kind of wanted to talk about in these episodes is the final sort of Caesar boasting scene. So after Caesar boasts about the fact that if Luffy picks a fight with him, he's got the might of the Shibukai and the Emperor is backing him due to them both being his clientele, he gets promptly blasted in the face by Luffy's fist with a badass line, "I've been picking fights like that all along." And this, of course, is kind of a meta reference to the fact that this scene bears a great deal of resemblance thematically to Luffy at Enies Lobby, where a similar character in Spandam arrogantly claimed that there was nothing Luffy and the Straw Hats could do against the might of the world government. And Luffy promptly and boldly picks a fight with them, declaring war on the entire world government as well as Spandam. And Caesar, like his thematic counterpart Spandam, also boasts how there's nothing Luffy and his alliance could do because of the might of the Shibukai and the Yonko backing him. And yet again, Luffy immediately jumps in and picks a fight, even referencing the fact that he's used to doing this because that's what he's been doing the entire series. He's been picking fights with people he's supposedly not supposed to pick fights with. Two of the biggest examples already are the world government and the Emperor Big Mom. And so he's definitely not a stranger to picking fights with people that are far bigger and stronger than he is. And the funny thing is Caesar is also trying to pull an Usopp on Luffy, trying to bluff and scare his opponents into running away before they even fight, because he knows he can't beat Luffy in a one-on-one matchup, which is also funny because we know that that wouldn't work on Luffy for a multitude of reasons, least of which is the intimidation factor, since to Luffy, he probably doesn't even process what the gravity of attacking an emperor really means anyways. And so that strategy is not going to work. Also, the fact that Luffy has seen Usopp try something like this a million times over. So definitely not the way to go against Luffy. Needless to say, this moment was incredibly satisfying to see that Caesar will finally get his just desserts with a full serving of an ass whooping from Luffy. Because if there was any one character that deserved more than anyone else in the series, aside from maybe the Celestial Dragons, it's motherfreaking Caesar. So I can't wait to see him just get beat down for good. But we'll have to wait till the next episode to kind of go into those. If you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, I would very much appreciate subscribing. And check out my Instagram at SunnyGo Podcast if you want updates of when I post new episodes, or to see some pictures of my manga collection and One Piece card collection as well. And yeah, like I've always said, just listening to the podcast is enough for me. But if you feel like doing some little extra support, feel free to support me at my Buy Me a Coffee profile. The link can be found on the website. However, donating or supporting me is certainly not necessary, and just listening is perfectly fine with me and enough for me, and I really appreciate everything from all of you. As always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to listen to my podcast. Just, I guess, a tiny spoiler comment. It's not even really a section, maybe just gonna take like 30 seconds to say, but it is something I kind of wanted to mention. But if you're not interested in that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye! Okay, so spoiler section. Really, the only thing I wanted to mention is the fact that it never really even dawned on me when Caesar mentions the army of zone type fruits and that one of the emperors is basically utilizing that. And I guess it just never, it seems so far of a concept for me that I never really even thought about it. But it was kind of cool to see when we get to Wano that actual sort of proclamation becomes true, but in a very messed up way, because we all learned that the smile fruits have an incredible defect, especially the ones that Caesar makes, whereas the ones that Vegapunk made are almost perfect except for the color is wrong. But Caesar's smile fruits, we do go on to see, are incredibly dangerous and incredibly risky to the point where only 10% of them actually grant powers, and everyone else are left in with this sort of disease or condition where they can't show any other emotion other than happiness and laughter anymore, which makes the name smile fruits even more like horrifying and creepy. And so yeah, I it's just funny seeing the sort of the montage of the all the animal, like these ferocious looking animal soldiers, and what we actually get, the gifters later on, it's kind of funny. Like while they are very intimidating and pretty powerful, they're not quite nearly as scary as they're shown to be in this sort of um, premonition or proclamation. And so yeah, I always found this scene a little funny upon rewatch and reread. But that's kind of all I wanted to talk about. Not really much to do with anything in the story, just a small observation on my part. But yeah, thanks for listening and see you next time.